Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Government information is the backbone of an open society. It enables accountability, supports research, and empowers citizens to participate in democracy. But today, much of that record is at risk. As more government information is published digitally, gaps in preservation are growing. Access is becoming more fragile, and vital materials can vanish with an executive order or the click of a button. If the public record can vanish overnight, what does that mean for transparency, history, and even democracy itself? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. I want to welcome you to our book talk. Today, we'll be discussing Preserving Government Information, Past, Present, and Future by, get ready for this, my favorite author duo of all time, James A. Jacobs and James R. Jacobs. Their book is a timely exploration of how preservation practices of the past shape today's challenges and what we must do to ensure the future. Our conversation will be led by librarian Shari Laster. As we get started here today, I would like to welcome Brewster Kahle, the Internet Archive's founder and digital librarian. And I know that Brewster has a lot of passion about government documents and government information these days. So I'd love to welcome Brewster and turn it over to him.
Thank you very much for James and Jim for writing a tome that we have already started to mass read at the Internet Archive because of the Democracy's Library project, which kicked off a couple years ago. Try to get all documents from all of the democracies available in bulk and in new services to go and help inform a population that's really trying to understand what the world looks like. The democracies need to have an educated populace, and so they tend to publish openly. But a lot of these documents are not available. It's surprising that the public domain is often not very publicly accessible. So let's change that. And the guidance that you guys, by having deep knowledge of the whole area of government documents in the United States, and it's going, Democracy's Library is also going on in Canada. How can we spread this out as a worldwide movement? And your leadership in documenting the importance of this whole thing is critical. So thank you very much for writing the book and coming in here to speak about it.
Thanks, Brewster. So here to introduce our speakers and to set the stage for the rest of today's discussion is Dave Hansen, the Executive Director of Authors Alliance.
Thanks, Chris. From my perspective, government information is one of the most critical pieces of research information that the authors that I work with rely on. I mean, it's really a fascinating thing to look across the range of authors, from historians to people in education to people in law, that are so dependent on access to government information and having some reassurance that the information that they're accessing is preserved in a way that maintains its integrity. And so I'm really excited for this talk, and I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers and then get out of the way so we can hand it over to them. So first I want to introduce James Jacobs, who's the U.S. Government Information Librarian at Stanford University Libraries, where he supports the research needs of the university and works on both traditional collection development as well as digital projects like LOCKSS US Docs. Among other things, he is the co-founder of Free Government Information, freegovinfo.info. I'm also pleased to introduce Jim Jacobs, librarian emeritus from UC San Diego, where he served as the data services librarian from 1985 to 2006. He has served as a technical consultant to the Center for Research Libraries in their audits and certifications of the trusted digital repositories of HathiTrust, Portico, and LOCKSS, which is pretty cool. And he is also co-founder of freegovinfo.info. So in conversation with James and Jim today, we have Shari Laster, who is the head of open collections, curation, and access at Arizona State University Library. In addition to prior experience as a government information librarian, Shari is past chair of the Depository Library Council, which is the advisory body for FDLP, and past chair of ALA's Government Docs Roundtable. So I am going to turn it over to you three, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks,
Um,
Brewster and Dave and Chris, for inviting us to speak today.
Yeah, thank you so much to the Internet Archive. This book literally could not have been written without the resources of the Internet Archive. We want to begin with a very simple example of government information, and that's the food pyramid, which probably many of you have seen before. The Department of Agriculture has been giving nutritional advice to consumers since at least the 40s when there was food rationing. And in 1990, they adopted an illustration of a pyramid to suggest different quantities of food and categories of food for a balanced diet. It's changed these illustrations over the year. Today, it's not even a pyramid anymore, it's a plate. And its advice has changed over the years about what good nutrition is and what different categories of foods you should eat in what quantities. But the record of those different government suggestions and advice is the history of our government. Preserving government information is about preserving all those different recommendations so that we can have a record of government activities. It's also about ensuring that the information that's created and collected and produced by the government is not erased or altered. And it's also about, although this food pyramid is a trivial example, the principle remains the same for laws, reports, and irreplaceable information that the government gathers through censuses and surveys.
Yeah. So there are a lot of excellent examples of projects that are addressing this complex and enormous problem that we're talking about in our book about the loss and the preservation of government information. And you can find a list of them at the datarescueproject.org website. They have a whole list of sort of a running list of projects that are currently active. And needless to say, the Internet Archive is central to the success of many of these projects, including one that's close to my heart, the End of Term Archive, which the Internet Archive is an active participant. These projects are all working to rescue specific publications, specific titles, specific websites, and specific data sets. But one of the problems that these kinds of rescue efforts face is that there is no list of what the government has published or altered or withdrawn. There's no denominator out there that we know of. We've tried to get a little bit closer in our book, but there's not really one number. And there's no list of what has already been preserved and protected against loss. There's not even a common agreement about what constitutes successful preservation. So without preservation infrastructure, preservationists like Jim and myself and Shari and lots of other people are essentially working in the dark.
So what we're trying to do with our book is provide a context for all of this. And we do that by doing three things, which we don't think anyone else has done before. The first thing is we analyzed a ton of data so that we could get that denominator that James mentioned, characterize the government, what the government is publishing digitally. We quantify what's being published, by which branches of government, and we try and describe the kinds of information they're producing. It's important to characterize the different kinds because government information includes everything from unique archival records to widely distributed publications like the congressional records to databases and raw data. We also analyze preservation data to characterize what the government is preserving. That gives us the numerator, and we can contrast those two numbers and find out what the gap is in government preservation.
Yeah, the second thing that we're doing in this book is we're examining why these gaps exist. We do this by looking at the preservation laws and the regulations and the policies, projects and activities in both the paper era, when government information was published in paper and ink books and distributed to FDLP libraries around the country, and now in the digital era, where virtually all government publications are posted as digital files on the web. This lets us pinpoint which preservation practices have worked and which have not worked and why. For example, one of the big causes of those preservation gaps in the digital age is the use of what we think of as paper era preservation techniques that simply don't work or don't scale in the digital age.
The third thing we do is to define the elements needed for a new digital preservation infrastructure, or DPI. We use those elements to suggest a framework for building an infrastructure, and we use that framework to provide a vision of how a successful DPI might work on the day-to-day level. Finally, we suggest the steps preservationists can take today to start creating and preserving information. If the preservation community, in which we include government agencies, but also non-government libraries and archives, work together toward a common goal of preserving government information, we won't find ourselves again having to rescue information as it is being deleted. Instead, we will preserve it as it is being published and protect it from alteration and erasure. The goal of a successful digital preservation infrastructure will be to preserve a record of changing government policies, not implement those policies by altering or erasing old information.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. And hi, everybody. Really excited to be here today to talk with James and Jim. So, just a little bit just of context from my perspective, because I'm super interested in long term public access to government information. I probably would have considered this book timely whenever it came out. I read an early draft in November 2024, just after the election, and I even remember thinking, this is timely. But recalling the concerns that arose prior to the start of the first Trump administration about stability of access to resources from the Obama administration absolutely did not prepare me for the landslide of changing access to resources from the Biden administration that started earlier this year. This landslide has been precipitated by a series of executive orders and other actions directing federal agencies to overturn their previous practices, including around diversity and inclusion, the climate crisis, public health, and so much more. And these orders have had profound effects on people and communities in the United States and around the world. And they've also served as a tool of erasure. They direct agencies to change the words they use now. They also demand that agencies seek to change the words they used in the past, which tries to change some of the evidence of past government activity, and in a sense is an attempt to change that past itself. And of course, they can't change the past. We can't change the past. US government information has never truly been unbiased and fully disinterested. But the digital environment that we live and work with today, it's possible that to kind of attempt to tweak some of the artifacts of this evidence here and there. And these changes are themselves evidence of government activity, which comes back around to why I'm so interested in public access to government information in the first place and why we need to work together on its preservation. So, as a librarian who focuses primarily on collections lifecycle management, I am certainly familiar with preservation, but I tend to be thinking a little bit more about the what to preserve than the how to preserve it. And so I think with that in mind, I want to get this conversation started by digging into what it means to preserve government information. And I'm just starting out with a quote from software developer and social scientist Ed Summers, who currently happens to be a colleague of James's at Stanford University. Ed has said, if you are not providing meaningful access in the present to digital content, then you are not preserving it. So that brings me to my first question for discussion. Jim, what is the relationship between access and preservation? And I'd just like to hear for US government information how it worked in the print era and how should this work in the digital era?
Well, thank you. One of the definitions, there are lots of definitions of preservation. One of the definitions of preservation is access in the future. And in fact, we've always had access to government information. I mean, we could get information that was made public. In the paper era, the access infrastructure was libraries. And because libraries guaranteed long-term access, preservation was sort of a byproduct of the access infrastructure. But in the digital age, that's changed. The access infrastructure, which is the web, has no preservation byproduct the way the library infrastructure did in the paper era. In most cases, there's no guarantee, legal or procedural or policy-wise, for long-term access to digital government information. Access can be withdrawn at the flick of a button. It was for a long time, we've been, I should mention that this book is not one of those overnight books that we wrote last November. James and I have been writing about this for 20 years. And for a long time, we were able to say, we'd able to pinpoint small areas where something would get taken offline or something would be changed. And we'd identify those and say, we need an infrastructure to keep this from happening. but mostly those were mistakes or aberrations. And this year, we've seen that it's not just the mistake or an aberration, but a government policy to erase and alter and remove information. That means that we really need a digital preservation infrastructure to complement the access infrastructure. And we don't have to start from scratch on that, is the good news. We've got lots of things in place. And James and I are not rocket scientists. We haven't like come up with some cool technical solutions. We're just drawing on things that we've all seen and used every day. I want to close before I turn it back to you, Shari, to say one of the other things that ways that we think about what preservation is in the digital age is to say that it has to have 5 guarantees. And those guarantees are not just that it's preserved, but discoverable. Not just that it's discoverable, but deliverable. Not just that it's deliverable as bits, but it's readable. Not just that it's readable, but it's understandable. And not just that it's understandable, but it's usable. And with that, I'll stop so that we can move on.
You know, what you're all saying makes a lot of sense and really lines up with my experience working with why do we do this work. And I think that, Jim, your sort of hierarchy of everything that preserved government information needs to be also speaks to some of the incentive structure around doing this work, right? Because if we preserve things and nobody ever touches it or uses it, how is that preservation? How does that actually advance these particular interests? And I think too that having a greater understanding of the technology side of how it is that digital content is captured and preserved can kind of help to elucidate why this relationship is in place. So why is it not enough just to say that, well, these bits and bytes are still out there somewhere? So I'm just wondering if you have any kind of reaction to the underlying why behind this way of thinking about preservation.
Well, I have 2 things. Always, always 2 things. One thing is that government information is valuable for a number of reasons. Some of it's valuable because it documents the activities of government and makes government accountable. But another thing is that government information is valuable because it's irreplaceable. Government collects a lot of information. It collects information from states. It does scientific surveys. It creates information by funding science. It collects information with censuses. It does GIS location. And that information, if we lose it, can't be recollected. You can't find out what the population of a city was in 1950 in 2025. You have to record that information and keep it safe. The second thing is that we talk about this in the book just briefly, that having the information preserved is important because the information has value. But the information really only has value if it's usable. It needs a use value as well as an intrinsic value. And we use the example of a tractor. You can have a very expensive tractor locked in a barn, but if the barn never gets unlocked and goes out into a field, you really haven't made use of the tractor. And the same is true of information.
And I think the piece that I've always been interested in that Jim hinted at is that the idea of control, all of the use of government information, access to government information, all of this can't be done unless you control that information. And that's one of the things that I think has sort of maybe gone away from the frontal lobes of many librarians with the internet age, and many in the public who think once it's published, once it's on the internet, then it's there forever. Thank you for the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, but that's not always the case. And we need to actually collect that information in order to do all of the other things, including preservation and access, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But control of the information, I think, is one of the keys.
Right. And just a conceptual underpinning of collecting information is itself really huge. But so I guess I want to next kind of move to one particular tactic for collecting government information, which is web harvesting. Can you give us a high level overview of web harvesting for US government information and who does what? Why do they do it? And I think there are some gaps. What are some of these gaps?
Yeah, I can handle that one, Jim. So web harvesting of the federal domain has been happening since the Internet Archive brought the Wayback Machine online in 1996, which may have been pre-internet or just when like Gopher switched over to internet, regular internet. But more concerted efforts began in 2004 and expanded with the inception of the End of Term Archive in 2008. End of Term Archive seeks to harvest the entire .gov.mil federal web domain every 4 years at the end of, or end and beginning of each presidential term, hence the name End of Term. There have been many smaller and more targeted projects from organizations like the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Records Administration, the Government Publishing Office, as well as individual libraries through programs like Archivit subscription service. Again, an Internet Archive service, thank you, one that I use very, very often. And lastly, there's been serendipitous web harvesting of individual URLs via things like Internet Archive's Save Page Now tool, which I'm sure everyone has bookmarked on their browser, right? Right? It's something that I use almost on a daily basis. When I answer a reference question or a research consult and I find an answer on the federal web domain, I always save that page so that I know that I can get back to it later in case things change or get deleted. So I like to describe what's happening in terms of web harvesting in a water metaphor, I guess. So there are drips and there are pools and there are oceans of web harvesting going on. But despite all of these activities, it's difficult to know the content gaps since we really don't have, as I mentioned earlier, we don't really have a denominator of the entire scope of the federal government information that's published on the web. There are some known gaps, for example, web and mapping apps that display data and or need to be queried or need to have a human input in order to, change the display or query a database. Those kinds of web tools that have become de rigueur in 2025 don't lend themselves to web harvesting via Heritrix or other sorts of web harvesters. There are projects that are underway. Some of the projects that are listed on the Data Rescue Project site are targeting these kinds of sites that don't lend themselves to traditional web harvesting.
I should just add that we document the gaps in the book. One of the things that we discovered, which sort of surprised me, is that the judicial branch and the legislative branch are fairly well preserved. It's the executive branch, which is, of course, the biggest branch and by far the biggest publisher, which is very badly documented, preserved. The other piece that we found, which I didn't realize, was that the legislative branch is preserved over and over and over again in many different ways, not just with web harvesting and not just with the Internet Archive. So there's some inefficiency in the current system, which we could improve on. We have the models.
Well, I'm really glad. And James, you briefly mentioned the U.S. Government Publishing Office, the Library of Congress, National Archives and Records Administration. So these are all federal agencies that play a critical role in the current federal government information ecosystem. And, I think that one of the things that I've reflected on is that they each have their mission and their target areas that they are able to work in at their current capacities and with the technologies and relationships that they have in place. And so it's important to recognize that also, though, that I think there's been a perception in the past that, oh, well, the government will take care of its own materials. And again, there are extremely hardworking folks in civil service who are working on efforts every single day. But we also have to acknowledge that there's different kinds of content and materials that just aren't being captured for reasons that you all go into in your book. So kind of moving us along a little bit, because we've been talking a little bit about this problem space. And of course, we want to talk about solutions. There's a lot more that goes into digital preservation than just scooping everything up from the web and hoping for the best. So can you introduce the concept of a digital preservation infrastructure, as you mentioned earlier, and just share just a little bit about the characteristics and some of the assumptions that go into thinking about this infrastructure?
Yes. First of all, a lot of people think of when we use term infrastructure, people think of things like highways and railroad tracks, and for transportation, and houses for housing infrastructure. And electrical infrastructure is the wires and cables and production of electricity. But we use a broader term that has been made popular in more recent years to mean the stuff that's built on top of that structure. And that means that it's made up not so much of hardware, but of social norms and common practices and principles and standards. It's kind of a soft thing, but it works when it works. And in fact, in our definition of infrastructure, when it's successful, it's invisible. You don't even know it's there until it breaks. And we've seen it break this year. In the paper era, the Federal Depository Library Program, the FDLP, which we've probably mentioned by acronym without spelling it out before, relied on the infrastructure of libraries. Libraries and their practices and functions. Nobody had to tell every library. There didn't have to be a law saying you should have shelves and catalog your books and maybe have a reference desk. That was the way libraries worked. And in the paper era, it made sense to just send public documents to libraries to provide access in both short-term and long-term. Let me give you some examples of some elements, though, because you asked specifically about those. One of the elements of a digital preservation infrastructures is simply to have a goal of preserving government information. A lot of times our goals are to keep our institution healthy, or to crawl the web, or to make sure that FDLP survives. But digital preservation needs a goal of preserving information. And if our institutions are the best ones to do that, our institutions will survive. And if they're not, then they'll be replaced by other institutions. It's also not about tactics and tools. It's about, we need the goal as is the thing that we point toward, and making sure that whatever it is we do with whatever tools ends up with the preservation of government information. Another element is to provide a way for libraries and archives to collaborate by fulfilling their traditional roles. As I mentioned earlier, government information covers everything from unique records that have never been published to common publications like the congressional record, to non-traditional in the paper era and now traditional in the digital era, information in databases and raw data files and so forth. In the past, archives collected those records and libraries collected publications, and it was kind of a clear-cut, mostly division of labor. But now those things are overlapping, both in how they're published and how they're preserved. But there's still a lot of differences. For instance, the National Archives only preserves about 1% to 3% of the records that agencies produce, whereas libraries have preserved closer to 100% of the published government information. So a DPI needs to harmonize those two things, make it so that libraries can keep doing what libraries do, archives can keep doing what archives do, but we'll have a big system that works for both. But the prime underlying element of a digital preservation infrastructure is to address the needs of users. That's the thing that allows us to decide, have we been successful or not? Not how many bits we preserved, not how many data centers we have, not how many files have been downloaded today, but are we addressing the needs of all users? And to do that, we need to challenge some of the assumptions from the paper era. One of those assumptions, I'll just give you a couple of examples, is the difference between availability and accessibility. Availability is binary, and information is either publicly available or it's not. Whereas accessibility can vary by degrees and different dimensions, such as discovery and identity and cost and how easy it is to use. Another assumption is the difference between information and information services. The web provides services that get at information, and our web harvesting mostly tries to preserve websites, but doesn't always get all the information behind the websites. And I'm guessing, I'm using myself as an example here, I don't really want to look at an old government website. I don't really care what it looked like. There are people who do, and we should address the needs of those people. But most people are looking for the information that those websites provided rather than what font did they use and what color and how trivial were the graphics that they used 10 years ago. So we need to start thinking about preserving information rather than preserving information services.
And just to kind of dive into a little bit more focus here, one of the things that I know you said in the book is a successful DPI should focus as much on discovery and delivery as on storing. So, in the context of web archiving, there is a discovery and delivery gap. And that's something that I'm very curious about, especially because we're speaking here today with our friends at the Internet Archive. Can you just, in our last couple minutes, say a little bit about that particular gap and maybe some solutions?
Yeah. So I I think there are some solutions starting to bubble up, and this sort of gets at what we've conceptualized as the digital preservation infrastructure. It's kind of layers of an onion where you have preservation and access and discovery all happening in conjunction with each other. So I talked a bit about web archiving as a significant tool to preserve that information. But web archiving is just the first necessary step of collecting content of importance. Preservation without access is just hoarding. So knowing that most people don't have the bandwidth or the technical skills to download and explore terabyte work files, end of term archives started in 2016 to do full text indexing of each of the end of term archives. You can access that search at web.archive.org. They have a collection search for each of the end of term archives. We've also done some exploration of different kinds of content that we've collected over time. For example, we've extracted out all of the PDF files from end of term crawls and are making those full text searchable, with the understanding and the assumption that, a PDF file is more than likely to be a published document or a report, something that people are more interested in accessing, not, as Jim said, the 2004 version of the EPA website. And on that front, we've done some smaller pilot projects targeting other kinds of information. One example that I particularly love is a brainchild of Jefferson Bailey at the Internet Archive. And he made a collection called the Military Industrial PowerPoint Complex, which extracted out slide decks from the .mil web domain that we had harvested through end of term archive and made that a standalone collection. I think that's a really beautiful thing and something that we can do more of. And so I want to expand on that and create other, what I like to think of as special collections. And the first one that I really want to work on, and one that's the impetus of a lot of the data rescue projects that are happening now, is to create a data collection extracted from the archives of, the 13 statistical agencies, as well as the Data Rescue Project and public environmental data partners, to enhance and expand on the work of those organizations in regard to collecting and preserving government data and making it accessible for the long term.
I just want to add quickly that we quote in the book a survey of library leaders. And one of the questions and answers that came out of that survey was that people didn't understand how archived websites are used for discovery or how they're referenced. So this isn't just us saying, I don't know how to do it. There are other people who are finding the current way that we do things primitive. And I think that it's the case that once we have an infrastructure for digital preservation, we can rely on things being where they are, not moving or changing, having persistent addresses. We'll be able to develop new services, information services for that information that target specific communities. And those communities can be very large, like a city or a state for public libraries or a large university, or very small, like a branch library or a community of people who are interested in military power plants.
Yes.
Well, that gives us all a lot to think about here. So thank you, Jim and James.
Thanks, y'all. That was really fantastic. And especially appreciate the discussion about discoverability. And I'm a librarian by training. I was a law librarian, actually. I still don't understand sudocs. So
I could talk in sudocs if you want. but the only one that would understand would be Shari.
All right. Thank you all so much. We could have gone on for, I think, like another hour. This was so fascinating, but I need to turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating conversation. I would like to go on for another hour. What I'd love for everyone to do is to be sure to grab your copy of Preserving Government Information. Again, you can download it, read it for free. You can also purchase it in print if that's the way you want to read it or consume it and hold on to it over time. It's a great book, fascinating authors as you've seen here today. A big thank you to James and to Jim and Shari for a fascinating conversation today, and to Dave Hansen and Authors Alliance, as always. Thank you for facilitating and co-hosting our sessions. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.